Hello, and welcome to day 5 of ITPro Live, our final day. I'm Maggie Holland, Group Editor and Editorial Director of the B2B titles at Dennis. That's Channel Pro, Cloud Pro, ITPro and the Business Briefing. And I've been your host for the start of each day for our week-long virtual event, as well as moderating a number of sessions. Each day we have focused on a particular theme, bringing a range of real-world experts and discussion points to the table. On day 1, we looked at the virtual enterprise. On day 2, we focused on modern cloud for modern business. On day 3, our theme was security and the evolving threat landscape. And on day 4, we looked at how you can effectively balance the need to innovate whilst keeping the lights on. We hope you found the event so far useful and informative, and we've got a fantastic lineup for today as we focus on how you can build a successful foundation for the future of your business. But before I introduce our keynote speaker, I wanted to thank everyone who has been involved in creating ITPro Live. A great deal of work has gone on behind the scenes to bring our topics to life, and our speakers have given up their valuable time to help ensure that you can make the right technology and business decisions to continue to add value in your organisations. Thank you so much to all our speakers, and a thank you too to our viewers for watching. And at the risk of embarrassing him, I'd like to give a special thank you shout out to Adam Shepherd, our Reviews and Community Editor, who has worked tirelessly both in front of and behind the camera to make this event a success on all fronts. Adam, you're a superstar. Right, away with the Oscar-like acceptance speech and on to our keynote for today. It is my great pleasure to introduce Nigel Kersten, Field CTO of Puppet, to our virtual stage. Nigel, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Maggie. Thank you for the warm intro and glad to hear the nice words about Adam. Always fantastic to work with. So hello, my name's Nigel Kersten. So I'm Field CTO at Puppet. And I'm going to give you a little bit of background on myself here. And I'm generally not a fan of credentialism, of people listing most of their resume at the start of a talk. But the main thing I wanted to get across here is that I'm going to be going through a little bit of a history lesson. And I've actually sort of lived through this history. This isn't just an academic thing to me. I'm also, even though I work at a software vendor that's very key to this whole space, I'm not here as a vendor pitching wares. It'd be fantastic if everyone who was listening decided to spend lots of money with the company and allowed me to retire early or use our tools to solve real problems. But genuinely, I'm actually really frustrated at the state of enterprise IT, and I'd really like to see it actually get better in my lifetime. I think we've made some big improvements, but I think as far as the foundation for the future, for the theme of this whole conference, there's a lot of work we could do. And I think in particular, what we've seen is that people tend to, at the risk of using a colonial term, cargo cult, or pay lip service to new frameworks that they adopt without really understanding the structural implications. So my background, I spent 4 years as an SRE at Google in the late 2000s and was heavily involved in dealing with all of that platform, a lot of the work that went on to later on become Kubernetes, various things like that. But then I moved to a software vendor that was a very tiny startup at this time, but it was around the same time as the birth of the whole DevOps movement. We've also been dealing with I've been an author on the State of DevOps report for quite a long time, which is one of the largest bodies of research around DevOps. About a year ago, I moved at Puppet into the services arm. So as Field CTO, I'm essentially CTO of the services, customer success side, helping large, complex organizations modernize their IT practices. So I tend to spend a fair bit of time in this space, not really just as a vendor, but doing a lot of sort of high-level consulting as well. And I'd say if I was to I'm going to give you a few messages for those people who have to tune out for various reasons early on in the process. But one thing I would say is that the biggest barrier I see to success is that most orgs aren't actually brave enough to follow through and make the radical change that's actually required. They might modernize their greenfield deployments, but they tend to ignore their legacy environments. And I just saw a really great tweet from Mark Burgess, in many ways one of the godfathers of the whole configuration management infrastructure as code space, the original author of CF Engine, where he said, most people and organizations have no patience for solving hard problems. They lack a vision and they don't trust. They give up long before progress can be made. They offer no mandate for innovation, so it's up to independent lone wolves to have the stamina. And this is definitely a thing I see over and over again, that there's individual champions who will make significant progress within their sphere in the enterprise, but they're stuck and there's only so much change they can make because the rest of the organization doesn't have the appetite for the radical change that's required. So to summarize what I'm going to be going through all of today, I'm going to say IT was pretty broken in most environments. I think most people would say that's still the case in a lot of places. And people were looking for solutions. And so taking a DevOps approach was one of those. A lot of them copied Amazon's approach to teams and tooling, but failed to take into account that they had large legacy environments and other structural differences compared to a company like Amazon. This has led to improvements in IT overall. We've seen improvement in the relationship between development and operations. We've seen certain people move faster, but we've seen that a lot of the folks who've copied this methodology are struggling now with governance. They're struggling with scale, and they're not necessarily getting huge improvements out of their legacy environments. The people who I do see succeed at this are taking a somewhat different approach to DevOps. Now, because our industry loves an X versus Y story, Vim versus Emacs, DevOps versus SRE became one of these things that people started talking about. I can see all of this as being perfectly complementary to a DevOps approach. I think we've seen a bunch of different definitions pop up in our space around what DevOps actually is. And I get frustrated when I hear journalists ask me the question of, what comes after DevOps? Because I don't think people have really understood that it's a very flexible and loose collection of practices that can actually create significant improvement. It's not about just improving your build or CI system and calling that team a DevOps team. I see SRE as a one way to make DevOps practices at scale actually work. But I think, again, you need to make sure you understand the structural differences between yourself and Google or Amazon, for that matter. So to hopefully give you more solutions than answers, one approach that I'm seeing that's actually succeeding really well in this space is to take on what's called a platform team. If you use Gartner's terminology, it's a platform team. Forrester are referring to this as automation strike teams. We're seeing other people talk about this as platform engineering. But I think there's a growing recognition that there's a way to do centralized, scalable DevOps, particularly in the enterprise, that allows you to get a lot of the benefits of DevOps, but still get a lot of the governance and control and compliance problems solved in a really consistent way. So one thing I want to try and make sure is also the number one message from all of this is just paying lip service to frameworks and adopting them blindly, I think just leads us to the place that Agile ended up in a lot of enterprise environments, where just because you're doing the rituals of the process of stand-ups, of having scrums, having sprints, that's not enough. There's almost always cultural change, organizational change, and other things that actually need to be done to get the benefits of that framework genuinely. Okay, so in this talk, I'm going to go through all of this. DevOps really started as a movement about a decade ago. I think the first DevOps days was 11 years ago or so, and it was a bit of a slow burn in terms of being adopted in the enterprise. We saw that it came a lot out of the US West Coast web scale companies, startups, various folks who recognized that infrastructure as code, programmable APIs, virtualization, all of these things meant that we could start actually applying software engineering principles to the way we did operations, and that we could solve some of the cultural problems by what's become a fashionable term to sort of shift left in the industry. So having development and operations actually collaborate more and get rid of some of those conflicting incentives that were around for an awfully long time. So for me, I don't want to go too much into a definition of DevOps because I think that's sort of a relatively dull topic in a way. But I think to illustrate, there's two common models. One is talking about the pillars of culture, automation, measurement, and sharing. And then there's another model that's being called the 3 ways of DevOps, of continuous learning, feedback loop amplification, and optimizing flow. And I think all of these things come together so that we can hopefully all agree that DevOps is not about just adopting a tool. It's not about just adopting infrastructure as code. It's not just about embedding operations folks in development, but it's a much bigger sort of philosophy than that. So why did people start adopting this? Well, as I said, enterprise IT, I think, has been broken and difficult for a very long time, and that's not necessarily a fault of all of the individuals. We didn't have all of the technologies to make this stuff easier, and we had a huge explosion of, and I include myself in this, largely untrained people. I have a philosophy degree, but was a computer nerd and happened to grow up at just the right time that people would start paying me money to do things with computers, which I think was very fortunate for me. But there was a lack of empowerment. Operations teams would often receive an application that was huffed over the wall to them. They were responsible for making it stable. And you had these really conflicting incentives of the operations team not wanting anything to change because they were being measured on stability and predictability, and the application teams being measured on being able to ship new features and new applications. And so these things were inevitably in conflict, and without collaboration, you weren't actually going to get really good results. And to be honest, I think to sort of not harp on this too much, but IT's always kind of sucked. I think we're only starting to really mature as a field. We've seen a bunch of different attempts at doing this. I think ITIL was incredibly important for the industry in terms of giving us a vocabulary. And another thing that I think is a false opposition people often set up is DevOps versus ITIL, because I don't think they have to be in opposition. Or the spirit of ITIL, I think, is, and particularly if you look at the modern versions that have had some really great people working on it, is actually really quite powerful. It's more the bureaucracy and bookkeeping that a lot of people adopted that I think got in the way of progress. But I see that problem get resolving. So when these big companies started looking at how to do DevOps, often internal champions, those lone wolves who had the appetite for change, who were they going to copy from? Well, everyone wanted to be a cool tech company. We're all being told over and over again, software is eating the world. We're seeing that various things were driving towards a commodity. If you follow Simon Wardley and all of his mapping stuff, that should be a common theme to you. And Google weren't really talking about SRE. There was this recognition that there was some sort of magic going on inside that company. But I think the two big companies that people were looking to copy were the ones who were actually talking about how they did the work. And for me, that was Amazon and Netflix. And so we saw two quite different approaches there. Netflix, which I'm not going to talk about too much, were really pushing a no-ops movement. And I think they were saying, the future is not having operations people. You're just going to have software engineers doing the work and operations fades into the background. And I think this can work if you're Netflix, if you have, one large complex application, you're hiring a bunch of really highly paid software engineers, you don't have a huge legacy environment encumbering you. That's a reasonably valid approach. But I'd note that we haven't seen a lot of traction in the last few years around no-ops and other people actually trying to copy it. So what did people copy about with Amazon? Well, I think the two big ones, the couple of big ones, there were things that I think have proven to be somewhat of a myth as being a functional approach in the enterprise. The concept of the two pizza team, that you don't have a team bigger than can be fed by two pizzas, I'm assuming of average size. And you build it, you run it. So if you're a software engineer, you're working on a software and development team, you build something, you're responsible for all the operational work as well. And you have cross-functional teams with operational skills and software engineering skills, and that's how it works. Now, all of this seemed like a great way to fix a broken IT landscape because it seemed very different from the hierarchical system that we had in the past. You paired this with the emerging sort of strategies that people had around DevOps. But the fundamental problem, I think, is that no one is Amazon. I mean, to almost 0% approximation, no one is actually like Amazon. There's a few different things there. One is a giant money-making printing machine in the basement papers over an awful lot of problems. If you're an incredibly profitable, incredibly fast-growing company, and I saw this in my time at Google, there's a lot of problems that you can just pay to go away in many ways. And cultural issues, all sorts of various things aren't actually as big a deal when everyone's making an awful lot of money. Also, most enterprises don't write all their own software. And they also don't have an incredibly competitive landscape of hiring, the top 5% supposedly of engineers in a very narrow definition of the diversity of Silicon Valley. Most people working in environments of companies that have been around for a while. They have a large legacy environment. They have working applications. We talk about legacy in a negative way an awful lot of the time, but the legacy environment are the working applications that are still delivering value to the business. And you have a lack of resources to go and rewrite all of these things, even if you could. Sometimes they're built on commercial off-the-shelf software that's not easily replaced. And even if there was a really clear return on investment of going and doing all of that rewriting so that you can move to modern infrastructure, that's a really difficult case to make internally versus doing new work. And it's not clear that everyone has the resources necessarily to do that. Those are huge software engineering principles. Most people do not have an environment where everything is a service, whether it be a microservice or something slightly larger, with great dependencies and a service discovery and registration system. And you see that there's some special things about Amazon, particularly to come back to my theme around braveness and courage. Most companies don't have the sort of leadership that can issue a mandate like the one Jeff Bezos issued in 2002. And I'm going to cover a little bit of what happened then. A lot of this comes from Steve Yeggie's rant, which has become somewhat infamous in the industry, where Jeff Bezos sent out this mandate to the whole company. It went like this: all teams will henceforth expose their data and functionality through service interfaces. Teams must communicate with each other through those interfaces. There is no other form of inter-process communication allowed. No direct linking, no direct reads of another team's data store, no shared memory model, no backdoors whatsoever. The only communication between services is service interface calls over the network. Doesn't matter what technology they use, HTTP, Corba, PubSub, custom protocols, doesn't matter. Jeff didn't care. And all service interfaces, without exception, must be designed from the ground up to be externalizable. That's to say the team must plan and design to be able to expose the interface to developers in the outside world. No exceptions. And then finally, anyone who doesn't do this will be fired. And I'm not sure it's desirable for every company in the world to have Jeff Bezos running it, but I think it's worth pointing out that it took this sort of radical change for even the Amazon that we see today to move from where it was to the absolute monster dominating our industry that it's become. I bet there's almost none of you who work in an enterprise environment where this sort of radical change was proposed and actually followed through on, that your organization had the appetite to do this, because it's a significantly more difficult decision than a company that's been born in the last decade or two than it is for someone who's been around for 100 or more years. So, well, there are a few lessons that I think Amazon learned as they went through all of this process. One is pager escalation is really, really hard through lots and lots of services. It turns out this can be really difficult in a big environment where everyone has disconnected services. Trying to work out where the actual fault is and escalate pages is really complicated. Your peers can denial of service you, and a lot of this still comes from Steve Yegg's rant, which is incredibly informative, and I suggest going and reading it if you can. Monitoring is QA, and at this sort of scale, production is the only place you can test reality. We used to have a lot of jokes about testing in production, I think, a few years ago. But what we see nowadays, I think, is that a lot of people are recognizing that with observability, the production is the only environment that actually matches production. And it's almost impossible to create artificial environments that reflect that well enough to understand the sort of complexity we deal with at scale. Service discovery and service registration is critical. You've got to be able to register a new service. Other people have got to be able to find it and know how to interact with it. And debugging is really hard. I think one of the things Amazon apparently did at this point was creating universal sandboxes for everyone to be able to debug each other's services. So there's a few other things, and I think you're going to hear the word platform bunched during this talk. One is that it's all about the platform. Amazon.com is not a good product in the traditional sense. It sort of breaks a lot of rules. There is an awful lot of stuff on the screen. It's all over the place. But really the value that Amazon provides is about being a platform for other sellers. And I think we've seen this with AWS as well. I don't know many people who would extol the UX benefits of AWS to interact with, but it has APIs. And the APIs are all over the place, and you can compose these things into building your new products and services. And this is really what it means to be a platform, to provide that sort of foundational layer that people can take attributes of the platform, bits of functionality, tie them together in the form of APIs, and build something new. And this is the theme I'm going to be going through on this talk. So let's summarize where we're at so far. Everyone's IT was pretty crap, so they started copying how Amazon were telling us they were organized. But most people weren't Amazon. Almost no one was. No one had the ability or the discipline or the systematic environment to pivot their entire business to have the other constraints that made Amazon successful at both infrastructure and development. And also, unlike Amazon, people were copying this team approach, the tool choice approach, without actually building a platform. They continued to build applications for external users. They just changed how they organized teams and left a lot of the business alone. And I think this is what we see a lot of the time with enterprise DevOps and its failure to scale, is that processes like change management and procurement are largely the same as they were a decade ago. And there's only so much success people can actually have without making those fundamental changes. Now, I'm sounding like I'm being a huge hater on DevOps, which is funny from someone who works very much at a DevOps company, has been in this space. But this wasn't an actual disaster. And in some ways, I think this has been a testament to how bad things were, that this sort of changes actually made an improvement. Individual applications got better, launches got faster, problems got fixed more quickly, and people started getting excited about DevOps in the enterprise, often driven by these lone wolves that we talked about, the change agents who are interested in pushing the boundaries forward because they were working in these big environments. I think it's important to not underestimate the impact that enthusiastic early adopters had. Even with a bad framework, with really good people, with good intentions, who have a good sense of what the business actually is trying to do, they'll actually be able to achieve an awful lot inside this sort of chaotic but productive environment. But most people haven't worked out how to institute the kind of process rigor on top of these disconnected islands of automation that we see that's needed to stop issues like governance and compliance actually spiraling out of control. So even though people were moving from this, heavily hierarchical world to small cross-functional teams that weren't coordinating with each other, little pods that actually were creating, as many problems as they were solving, things were getting better. We were removing some of the clashes of incentives between development and operations, and people were enjoying their job more because they were more empowered. I think one of the things that we've seen that once you move beyond the early adopter phase is that there's an awful lot of software developers who don't want to do operations, and operations people who don't really want to do software development. I saw a joke someone made recently on Twitter about, operations people who like to program are basically just the ones with ADHD who like being interrupted all of the time. And I think there is something different about the role of being an engineer, building a project for a long time that's software, versus people who like operations, who like monitoring, who like examining the state of a running system. So I think we started to see that enterprises started running out of people who both had the software engineering skills and the operational mindset to do this stuff really well. So we saw a lot of people starting to be skeptical about DevOps, a lot of these initiatives failing. One of the jokes I regularly make is that for the number of enterprise transformation projects I see very, very few actually transformed enterprises because this work is hard. And I think one of the big myths in our industry is that, software or frameworks will magically solve your problems. Fundamentally, day two operations is difficult. And we work in a complex space. And even the best tools are going to still be complex to use. They'll just allow you to achieve an awful lot more. So around this time, so talking, probably 4 or 5 years ago, I guess, Google then decided to come out with the SRE book. They decided to, open the veil and say, this is how we do operations. Because I think we'd seen a lot of SREs at Google move on to other companies and start to adopt some of these practices. We saw software tools get invented at startups because people were missing having that functionality inside Google. And then so Google came out with the SRE book, which is a fantastic book for talking through their methodology for doing operations at scale. And it's really great that they actually started talking publicly about this because I think it was hidden for far too long. And I'm not going to go into SRE an awful lot here because I think that's another whole talk just on its own. But unless you're willing to make the same kind of incredibly disruptive change to your organization that Amazon did, you're not going to get the same results as Google. There's some fundamental differences, like the fact that the head of SRE can remove SREs from software projects if they're not using that resource properly. There's all sorts of incentives internally at Google that make SRE functional. Focusing on reliability is good. Treating operations as an engineering discipline is also good. And focusing on the whole site rather than individual application is also good. So I think we're starting to see the same kind of things that people did with following Amazon's methodology. They're missing some of the critical points. Google internally operates very much as a platform. What we've gotten in the world with Kubernetes in the last few years is a result of the platform approach that Google has taken and many of the lessons they've learned there. So I think, what I'm trying to show here is that I think we've got a bit of a pattern of behavior in the industry. We look for the magic bullet, but then we copy it and miss some of the point, much like how Agile often gets abused in large enterprises and doesn't necessarily deliver on its promise. People take an Agile, DevOps, SRE, and copied some of the behaviors and processes that caused other, either much smaller or much younger organizations to succeed using those practices, while failing to actually be thoughtful about the structural aspects that have led those companies to be successful. So now that we're kind of done with the history lessons and set some of the stage, what's the actual solution I'm proposing here? Well, before I get into the platform team approach that I'm seeing work in a bunch of places, one lesson we really should take from this is you cannot just take someone's framework and blindly copy it and adopt it. The most important thing you can do is to take an adaptive approach. Create a function that in kind of in terminology is focused on improving your ability to sense situations, analyze the results of what's going on, and responding to them. You should be tweaking all of these approaches based upon your needs and your business. Because even though we say that, 90% of what people do in IT is the same as everyone else, everyone's business is different. And while I think you need to work out how to strike the balance between standing on the shoulders of giants and making use of other people's work and not in reinventing the wheel, but also recognizing that there are things that are different about your particular industry and your particular business and your particular people. Because what we never have the luxury of is throwing away all of the people who have all of the business context and making them part of the journey of actually improving things. So platform teams, automation strike teams, platform engineering, whatever we call it. Let's quickly cover how traditional operations worked. Application teams were responsible for delivering value to the business. In the course of working out what they needed to build, they would go to the operations teams and make requests of them for infrastructure they could build stuff on. And so I think this was one of the big things with DevOps, of focusing on business value from inside operations, recognizing that you need to actually understand what's being delivered here and you collaborate with development on it. So we had an incredibly siloed situation in many organizations, and we still do. So what does a platform engineering team look like in contrast? Well, the overarching goal is to deliver infrastructure to product teams in the form of self-service products through an API. Now, self-service and API are absolutely critical terms here. The platform team should manage all of the back-end infrastructure themselves, and they abstract away their implementations and the nitty-gritty operational management and bundle it all behind an API that's designed to be self-service by the people consuming it. This has to be API first. We've seen from the Amazon story that this is the way to get leverage. Expose your infrastructure in a way that allows people to consume those APIs and compose them to deliver higher value solutions on top of them in an automated manner. It's not that GUIs aren't important, but I think we see that there's a real path where people start using a GUI self-service tool, and then they need to move on to an API one so they can compose them and integrate them in an automated fashion. This is where I think purely GUI-driven enterprise self-service software catalogs, as we sort of understood them from a lot of the 90s and 2000s, really failed to follow through on their promise, because there's only so much extra value you can build on top of them, and they end up just becoming something where you can go and check something out at human speed rather than at computer speed. I also use the term product here, and I think product mindset is absolutely critical. If you're building products, and anything everyone knows about modern product management, you don't do it in isolation. You don't take your group of product managers, go to the top of the mountain, wait for inspiration to strike, and then bring that wisdom back down to the masses. We know how to do modern product management in a lean way, and it involves constant feedback. It involves working with customers, the people who'll be using things, and iterating on the thing that you're building until you get to something that's actually valuable, which means you're interacting with users, you're testing your hypotheses, and you're most importantly focused on the user's problems and solving them. And I think this is one of the big mindset shifts to take in operations. When you're moving to a platform team, you're building self-service products, which means you need to go and engage with the people who are using it, work out what their problems are, and then solve them. A side note here would be that one of the other things we often talked about in DevOps is empathy. And we can see that, I think here, that this is strongly relevant to taking a product-centric approach to the things that you're building. Empathy is about putting yourself in someone else's shoes, understanding the state that they're in. And this is exactly the kind of knowledge that you need to have in order to build a good self-service product for them. Now, again, a lot of people will consider this to be, in opposition to DevOps, because their understanding of DevOps is small teams, highly empowered, making lots of decisions themselves and having lots of them within an organization. I don't see this in oppositional. I think this is really just an evolution, and it's taking DevOps principles and applying them to the particular shape of problem that the enterprise actually has. So we've got a good overview of the goals of a platform team and what you're trying to deliver. So what is it that you actually need to succeed at them? You need that cross-functional team of people with operational experience, an operational mindset, and software engineering skills. You need to have folks who drive towards automation, who their first inclination is always to work out how can they automate a thing, and rather than following a manual process. For those who are managers or in leadership roles inside organization, this team needs to have longevity and consistency. So one of the biggest failure states that I see large enterprises fall into these days is they start following something like the platform team approach, and they compose it of a lot of really valuable people. Because the reality is, people who get DevOps stuff are valuable in organizations. People who have the social skills to understand other people's problems, who like working in that way, who can automate things, who can write code, who know infrastructure as code, tools like Puppet and all of the other various things there. These people are valuable. And so they often get formed into a team, and then some major incident happens somewhere else while everything's still, on fire, and they get seconded. They get pulled away from the platform team to go and solve that problem. And I see this over and over again. It's important for this team to be cohesive and to actually have some longevity. This team has to be responsible both for managing the actual platform and building the APIs that abstract it away. Another mistake that I see people make an awful lot of the time is to have two separate teams doing this work. And really, you're just setting up the same problems that led to the rise of DevOps in the first place. You need to have the people who are responsible for the operational stability of the platform, because this thing, if lots of your teams are relying on it, needs to be incredibly reliable and predictable. You need to have the people who care about that operational stability also being the ones who have to advance the platform forward and keep building new APIs and new services and modernizing things so that people use them. You need to keep that tension together in the one team. Otherwise, you're just creating the same problems over again that led us to chase down DevOps. And I'm largely going to skip over the automation requirements here because I think that starts to get much too close to a vendor pitch. But you need an automation platform that's just opinionated enough, that's flexible, and that can operate in multiple modes that can both deal with configuration drift for an ongoing basis, as well as give you a platform for making your operational tasks significantly easier. This needs to be accessible, and it needs to be something that isn't just manageable by a high priest cabal of a small group of individuals. This needs to be something that's actually pretty useful to an awful lot of people. So that's the team requirements. There's one really key role here that I've also seen people underinvest in. That platform team must have a dedicated product manager, both to be the person who's not building the things, who's not managing the operational issues, who's not necessarily wearing a pager, but serves the role of the product manager. They have to be the person who goes out and discovers problems that application teams need to have solved and balances out all of those competing requirements of stability, feature development, and the prioritization of new features. But perhaps most importantly, this person needs to be responsible for evangelizing. Because what I've seen again over and over again is a top-down order for everyone to just use the platform really doesn't work. The platform has to be valuable. And in order to do that, you need to actually make sure that people are using it. This person needs to be able to look at legacy environments as much as greenfield. Excuse me one sec, I'm just going to mute and you can significantly improve your legacy environments by progressively replacing infrastructure requirements with a self-service product interface, even if you don't have dedicated teams. The other point I guess I'd say for leadership groups in particular is you need to have continuous investment in the platform itself. This is not a one-off project. It's not a one-off investment. You need this project and platform to continuously get investment so that you're keeping up with the changing requirements of your app teams. Otherwise, you're just going to end up getting shadow IT reinvented, essentially. So why does this approach work? Well, you have a single point of control to solve issues like governance and compliance and auditing. You have your operational burden largely taken up by people who have operations experience and a mindset. You're still increasing the efficiency of your development teams by taking that operational burden off them. And you're abstracting away the infrastructure from the interface that the consumers of it use. So long as you're actually serving their needs, you can iteratively replace legacy infrastructure layers with more modern ones as appropriate. Your progress doesn't get hampered by individual app teams tying their implementations to the current version of the infrastructure. So to summarize, don't just blindly follow other people's frameworks and methodology without understanding why it's working for them. In particular, and I think we get a lot of conference talk driven project changes and transformation projects, look out for future tense in conference talks. I get, my spidey sense starts to go whenever I see lots of talks where people are talking about, I will do this, we are planning to do this, and talking about it like it's a big transformation project. I think we're particularly susceptible to this in the enterprise DevOps space. You go and talk to people on the ground, and the actual improvements are often not that dramatic or all that consistent. So talk to people who've actually made the changes, but understand what it is that led them to be successful. If you're having trouble scaling your DevOps approach and you've got lots of disconnected teams like this who are doing okay at a local level, but creating global problems in the organization, or if you've had success taking this approach to greenfield deployments, but not your legacy environments, consider a platform team approach. See whether you can get more than the sum of the parts out of it by gathering together a group of folks to build something that the rest of your organization can build upon. And the last little pitch would be, if you're looking for help on this sort of work, feel free to always come talk to us at Puppet. Also, I'm actually really intellectually interested in this space, so always feel free to email me, nigel@puppet.com, to talk about this. And with that, thank you, and back to Maggie.
Fantastic. What a great opening keynote. Thank you so much, Nigel, for joining us and for sharing that valuable insight.